This is Green Street, the Environmental Health Show, greenstreetnews.org, Patti and Doug Wood, and our worldwide network of experts here every week to keep you up to date on what is happening around the world and how you can keep yourself and your family safe and healthy, because the government probably isn't going to do it for you. Welcome back. There's a lot of talk these days about how the oil and gas and coal industries are working hard to reduce their impact on the climate. They claim they've got some brand new technologies and techniques that can help make their products safe for the environment. But we've heard that story before. Today on Green Street, we'll talk with someone who knows exactly what's going on in the world of energy, what's true and what's not so true. And he'll join us later in the show to talk about it. But first, let's look at some of the news stories that caught our attention this week. Patti, what have you got for us?
Well, this one is about wildfires, and it's on everybody's mind.
Yeah.
Wow, what they have been through in California. Wildfire retardants, that hot pink mix of water and chemicals sprayed from airplanes by the U.S. Forest Service to combat wildfires, are under scrutiny. This is after a recent study found that they're a serious source of heavy metal pollution in the U.S. Wildfire retardant is composed of about 85% water, 10% fertilizers, and a mix of other undisclosed ingredients that sticks to plants and depletes the fire of oxygen. This study cracks open the chemical black box of the proprietary undisclosed ingredients in wildfire retardants.
Yeah, you see those planes, just dumping that.
I always think about it, and I always think about the vineyards and the farmland out there. So most of it was applied in the western U.S., where the area burned by wildfires has increased by 8-fold over the past 4 decades. Firefighters have argued that retardants are an important tool for protecting communities and slowing down fire.
I get it, that they work, but this reminds me of the World Trade Center, where twice as many people died after event because of what was in the air than died at night.
And what was burning from those buildings.
And what was burning from those buildings. So here we have a situation. We're going to put out the fire. We're going to save houses, and that's great, and save property. But what's it doing to the people?
Yes, and after the initial firefighting efforts that went forward in these recent California fires, now they're talking about not letting people into those neighborhoods because of the toxic chemicals, right? And because of the pipes and so on. So in fire-devastated areas, damaged pipes can suck in the smoke, and plastic pipes can melt and release harmful chemicals into the water, causing spikes in concentrations of harmful chemicals like benzene and other carcinogens. And the evidence of heavy metals presence in wildfire retardants adds to the burden these chemicals are posing to water treatment systems. So now the challenge for the Forest Service is that they've done such a good job marketing this magic red elixir that it's hard for them to back away from it and say, oh, it turns out that the stuff we've been pouring all over your forests and your backyards and your residential areas is actually poisonous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a mess.
Yeah.
All right.
See what happens.
CNN is reporting that the FDA banned red dye number 3 30 years after it was shown to cause cancer in rats. And
a single dye. A single dye.
That's all they did. They banned red dye number 3.
And so now I want to know when that's going to go into effect.
Okay, so many people are criticizing or questioning the safety and the FDA's allowance of red dye number 40 and 5 other color additives that are commonly used in food in the United States.
Especially food that our children eat.
These are made from petroleum and chemically known as erythritine. Red dye number 3 is a synthetic color additive used to give foods and beverages a bright cherry red color. The dye has been permissible for use in food, beverages, and ingested drugs, even though the Delaney Clause of the Food and Drug Administration Act prohibits FDA from approving a color additive that, if ingested, causes cancer in animals or humans. So 30 years ago, they showed it caused cancer, and they kept putting it in anyway. CNN says the FDA's decision this week to revoke the authorization for the use of the dye was acting on a 2022 petition by advocacy organizations and individuals citing this research. An FDA spokesman said in a statement via email, the FDA is actively working to develop transparent processes for prioritizing chemicals in food for a safety review as part of the agency's effort to build a robust and systematic post-market review program. Well, 30 years it took them to ban a dye which was shown to cause cancer in animals. I mean,
a single dye.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
How many kids do you know who always choose the red lollipop?
Every kid chooses the red lollipop. They want the red M&Ms. They want the red, whatever candy it is.
Right now, we have a lot of natural dyes that are made from vegetables.
Yeah, beet juice.
That's exactly right. And turmeric and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. What else you got?
Okay. Since January 20th,
Mark that date on your calendar. Yeah.
Plans to advance environmental justice have been taken offline at the White House, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of the Interior, and elsewhere. At the Department of Transportation, for example, staff was ordered this week to dismantle any rules and regulations referring to environmental justice, also climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. The Trump administration is also trying to freeze or claw back about $3 billion in grants created in the name of environmental and climate justice under the Inflation Reduction Act. At the Department of Justice, the Office of Environmental Justice, a new hub created in 2022 to coordinate federal environmental enforcement, was eliminated, and its website was deleted.
Shut it down.
With environmental justice, as with other liberal policies that seek to redress prior wrongs, conservatives claim that there is an unwarranted and selective focus on race.
Wait a minute. They're not prior wrongs. They're continuing wrongs. They're wrongs
ongoing.
that are happening right now.
It's called ongoing. Veterans of the Biden administration said cases were never brought on the basis of race, but it would have been easy to get confused. One of the former president's executive orders made the association explicitly, noting, quote, racism is a fundamental driver of environmental injustice.
Yeah, of course it is.
Wow. And here's a little piece about Cancer Alley that you mentioned. The conservative view that the feds have gone out on a limb with their environmental justice program was endorsed by a district court in Louisiana last year, following a lawsuit from residents who live on the Mississippi River corridor of petrochemical facilities known as Cancer Alley. The EPA started an investigation of Louisiana's permitting process. Siding with the state, the Trump-appointed judge wrote that pollution does not discriminate and that if a decision maker has to consider race to decide on enforcement, it has indeed participated in racism. Robert Bullard, often considered the father of the environmental justice movement, said that it made no sense for environmental justice to be thrown out with DEI. It's not the same, Bullard said. Yeah. The right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and to have our food safe to eat, and have our kids play on playgrounds that are not contaminated, that's not DEI. The government begs to differ. I mean, we've got a really deep reach into everything going on here.
It's a new world. All right. Thanks, Patti.
You're welcome.
In the world of environmental politics, spin is everything. If you're an energy company, your job is to convince the world that your products are not responsible for climate change, that your products are absolutely necessary to sustain life as we know it. And anyway, you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars developing ways to render your products virtually harmless. If you're a lawyer at the Center for International Environmental Law, your job is to see through the spin, to find out what's really going on in the oil and gas and coal industries to the extent you can, and to use international regulations to hold these companies to account while you lobby for even stronger laws to protect the public. Steven Feit is one of those lawyers, a senior attorney in CIEL's Climate and Energy program, who joined the organization back in 2015. Patti and I spoke with Steven last week, and we asked him first to tell us a little bit about the organization. Here's our interview with CIEL's Steven Feit.
The Center for International Environmental Law, or CIEL, has been around since 1989. And in general, we use the power of the law to protect the environment, promote human rights, and ensure a just and sustainable society. I mean, CIEL has been involved in climate negotiations, international trade, the development of international legal regimes, finance, and the development of accountability mechanisms at multinational development banks, and a host of other places where we've engaged over the years. I joined CIEL in 2015. And my trajectory has followed, I think, a lot of the trajectory of the growing understanding of fossil fuels and their place in not just the climate crisis, but plastics and toxics and a bunch of interrelated crises. that work brought me into the plastics and petrochemical space, noting the fact that plastics are just made from fossil fuels, from oil and gas. Similarly, fertilizers, or I should say nitrogen fertilizers, are made from fossil fuels. And so there's this enormous category of products in this market for fossil fuels that doesn't look like what most people think fossil fuels looks like, but represents an increasing and rapidly growing share of fossil fuel use. Our work on climate accountability brought us into both carbon capture and the broader geoengineering debate. And that led us to really start engaging with geoengineering in around 2019, which brought me into the carbon capture, carbon management paradigm, because there's the solar radiation modification level of geoengineering, but it's also connected to carbon dioxide removal in the sense that you need to really engage in large-scale carbon dioxide removal to avoid termination shock from solar radiation modification. And if you're doing that in a manner that produces concentrated carbon dioxide streams, that's fundamentally connected to point source carbon capture and storage.
Okay, Stephen, you got to back up. What is
Yeah.
termination shock? What is that?
So solar radiation modification, the idea would be to do something to reflect or diffuse sunlight coming into the earth.
Right, either particles that are going to reflect it or cloud-based things that are going to reflect it, right? Redirecting it back out into space somewhere where it can bother somebody else and not us.
Exactly. But so if you do that and then you stop, then the planet will heat back up to, whatever it would be with the normal radiation balance. If you start doing solar radiation modification while greenhouse gases are accumulating, then the greenhouse gas load in the atmosphere is even higher than it was when you started, which means to keep, the temperature decrease at the same level, you need to increase the amount of SRM that you're doing. And then if you stop, everything heats up really quickly.
I see.
So there's a real downside to this, but basically what you're saying.
You could say that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So for our audience, can you just talk very briefly about carbon capture? I mean, we know what it is, but if you can just talk about that as quote unquote the solution that, many of the fossil fuel companies are looking at.
Absolutely. So the basic idea of carbon capture is fairly simple. It's carbon dioxide comes out of smokestacks or, tailpipes or what have you, and you capture it and you pipe it away somewhere and put it underground, and then it doesn't go into the atmosphere and it doesn't cause global warming and climate change. It sounds easy, sounds great. Sounds like just putting a filter on something, but it's none of those things. If we just talk about it from a climate perspective, first, carbon capture doesn't do anything to change the emissions at other points in the chain. So the emissions from fracking and from refining and from whatever else, it doesn't address those. It actually makes them worse because carbon capture and storage, CCS, requires pretty enormous energy to run. The energy penalty, as it's called, can be on the order of 25% or more of the energy of the process to which it's being affixed.
Really?
So it means that you need to produce more fossil fuels on the front end to get the same out on the other end. It also doesn't, even by its proponents' claims, capture all of the carbon emissions. So it doesn't eliminate the problem, even on its own terms. It just reduces it. But it also has a long history of underperformance, that proponents will claim 90% capture, but what you end up seeing is 90% capture for a particular runtime or for a particular piece of the plant. And there are a bunch of technical and operational issues, and maybe it has to shut down, or maybe it can't inject the CO2 as much as proponents would like it to. Or maybe the economics of it stop working, and so it just actually goes offline altogether. And all of this then presumes that the CO2 can be reliably stored underground, which, as we've seen, is not a guarantee. There's one well in the United States, in Illinois, attached to an Archer Daniel Midlands ethanol plant. Learned recently that that's leaking. There have been problems with class 2 wells in Texas that are failing the mechanical integrity tests that are used to inject CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And that's maybe the last piece of this puzzle, that the primary market for carbon dioxide is in drilling for oil. There's a technique called enhanced oil recovery, where when an oil well is more or less spent, you can inject carbon dioxide and push out oil that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get. And so a large part of the push for carbon capture is in accessing carbon dioxide. The limiting factor for enhanced oil recovery in the United States has been securing access to affordable supplies of carbon dioxide.
Wow. So in other words, they're also using it to get more out of these wells.
Exactly.
Right. Kind of like putting a straw in and getting up the last bit of it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Exactly.
Okay.
There's also a bunch of other hazards from this whole process, right? That at the point of capture, you're using really alkaline caustic chemicals. And so you get ammonia emissions at the point of capture, in addition to more fossil fuel combustion and emissions at the point of capture. The pipes themselves are transferring CO2 that, if it releases, it's not like an oil or gas pipeline that, I mean, it's still obviously terrible when it ruptures, but CO2, you can get really rapid expansion, and you can get it covering large areas and asphyxiating all the breathing organisms like humans, but also like wildlife in the area. And then, of course, when you inject it underground, you can get seismic activity, you can get contamination of groundwater, including potentially water that people might be drinking. So there's a number of non-climate related hazards involved in this process as well.
So it's the same thing that they're doing with the wastewater, right? Or the brine from fracking operations. They're doing the same thing. They're injecting it under tremendous pressure into these wells. Well, okay. But I'm trying to figure out how they're capturing it, how they get it to these places and, inject it underground.
Yeah, so there's two main ways. What we typically call carbon capture is point source carbon capture, where it's coming from some kind of smokestack at a factory, at a power plant, where there's a concentrated stream of carbon dioxide. There is also direct air capture from the ambient air. That is much more complicated, much more difficult, because the CO2 isn't concentrated like it is after you burnt gas or coal or something like that.
Right.
And that requires even more energy, even more use of chemicals, but still conceptually produces that stream of carbon dioxide. Of course, the largest project proposed I don't know if it's in the world, but certainly in the United States, is from a subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum, from which they are also marketing sort of carbon credits.
So, Stephen, the whole point of this is to allow these companies to continue business as usual, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. That's what they're trying to do. They're not trying to save the planet. They're trying to save their own skin, save their own businesses, continue to be able to continue,
To
drilling,
burn
for
and
fossil
release
fuel.
carbon dioxide and,
Yeah,
do
I
their
mean,
thing. Finished. Problem solved.
Yeah,
Not
I
at
think
all. Not at all.
exactly.
Right.
This really is the way to accommodate the business model of the fossil fuel industry to the 21st century, to suggest that we can decouple the carbon emissions from fossil fuels from the energy that they can provide, whether it's through carbon capture directly or through the production of hydrogen and ammonia, to which carbon capture is applied further upstream. It's all the way to launder emissions and to suggest new or consistent business models under the guise of climate action.
So, Stephen, have they realized that they've got this problem, and have they been working on this technology for a while before it really kind of came to the surface of public awareness?
Yeah, so this is not new technology. One of the great tricks that the industry is able to keep pulling is to suggest that this is a new technology that's just on the verge of massive new breakthroughs and huge cost reductions, and we just need to invest a little bit more, and it's just around the corner. The reality is that this has been happening in the United States since the 1970s.
Mm.
And patents for capturing carbon dioxide from waste streams go back even further than that. But the effort, I mean, this was what clean coal was back 15 years ago. There were efforts before this in the 90s. The federal government has invested quite a bit, not just the US government, but especially the US government has invested quite a bit in carbon capture research. And what we've seen, this has been reflected in some sort of economic studies. This has also been acknowledged by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that the kinds of cost reductions that you would expect to see in technologies like solar or batteries, where you have small, simple, modular components and prices drop really quickly, you don't see in carbon capture because it's complex, it's bespoke to each facility to which it's attached, and that we're not seeing the kinds of increases in effectiveness or reductions in cost that you would see in those other technologies, and that we shouldn't necessarily expect to.
So, okay, so I can't wait to ask you about this. In the world of fossil fuels, we're seeing this carbon capture technology as a way to kind of decrease pressure to really address the problem. Do we see the same thing in the world of plastic pollution, where they've got this technique they call pyrolysis? I'm just curious is that the same kind of thing where they've got a technology that we're not sure it really works, and certainly in the long term to address the plastic problem? I mean, I've heard a lot of things about pyrolysis not really working. I'd love to get your view on that.
Yeah, so the pyrolysis again has been around for a really long time. It's most recently been described as either chemical or advanced recycling. There are some other techniques that fall into that category, but yeah, I mean, this is the same model of end of the tailpipe false solutions that purport to deal with the symptoms of the problem without addressing the underlying cause. But of course, when you examine these things with greater scrutiny, they break down. I mean, advanced or chemical recycling, pyrolysis, the kind of physical chemistry math doesn't work. Others have done some really good analyses of this, that the amount of energy that you put in and what you're able to get out in terms of energy and material is just massively imbalanced. This is not a kind of circular process that just you put in plastic on one side and you get plastic, or the monomers to make plastic on the other. It's you get all sorts of different hydrocarbons and some wastes and a lot of toxic materials. I think that's the other thing that doesn't get addressed in this conversation about recycling, whether it's mechanical or, pyrolysis, that one of the issues with plastic is obviously the sort of visible environmental pollution that we see.
Right.
But there's also enormous harm done on the production side, and a huge amount of harm has been done by the time a plastic product is on the shelves. Because again, we're talking about fossil fuel production, refining, cracking, which is this really intense chemical process that produces, toxins and requires a lot of energy. Then the addition of a bunch of toxic chemicals and additives, as well as non-intentionally added substances that get into these products. And then all the while, the creation of microplastics, either primary or secondary, all by the time a product is on the shelves. So it's also worth asking, not only do these techniques not do what they purport to do, it's worth asking the question of what problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah. So the Center for International Environmental Law, obviously you're focused on the existing laws that are out there, existing legislation that can be used. Do we have the forums that we need to actually make these laws work?
Yeah, and I want to add that the plastics, these international plastics meetings that they're having twice a year now to try to figure out how to manage this, I don't want to call it a product, this substance that is now everywhere, including in our bodies. Why do we have so many industry people sitting at the table in greater and greater numbers?
Well, I can address the second part, I think, more easily, which is to say, yeah, it's absolutely a problem. CIEL has done an analysis for each of the past few of these INCs, these international negotiating committees, and we see an increasing presence of plastics and chemicals and fossil fuel industry lobbyists. There are other models, including in the tobacco context, where it's understood that industry cannot feasibly have a seat at the table. And I think that kind of understanding is increasingly being understood, or that approach is increasingly being recognized as the correct one. The challenge we have is that we're already one INC past where we thought we would be, and this one is intended to be the final one where we get a treaty. But yeah, the role of the industry here is absolutely problematic. Doug, to your question about do we have the institutions? I don't think we have everything that we need, but we can do a lot with what we already have, right? There are bills in Congress and the creation of this global plastics treaty to put things in place that don't exist, to get at the problem directly and to get at the problem head on. But there are a lot of tools that can be used in the meantime where we see significant under-regulation, whether that's under-regulation under the Clean Air Act, under-regulation under TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, under RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. There's a lot of juice left to squeeze out of the regulatory system. In this moment, that's obviously not the direction that the federal government is going right now, to put it mildly, but those tools do exist. And then there's also the venue of the courts. And we're increasingly seeing litigation, especially in the plastics context, from cities and states, both trying to deal with the public nuisance of plastic pollution, as well as misrepresentations from the industry, most notably from California Attorney General Bonta's case.
Yeah.
Yeah, the recycling thing.
Yeah. Okay, so do you sleep at night? Are you optimistic that we are gonna be able to find our way through this?
With respect to climate, all of this is going to be on a spectrum. Every hundredth or thousandth of a degree of warming that we're able to rest down, like all of that matters. Every ton of microplastics that we keep out of our bodies is a victory, right? So that's the perspective I take. Another way of framing that in the climate context is, we're winning, but not fast enough, because it is so urgent. I mean, I don't know, optimism and pessimism are too fixed, but I have a lot of hope.
So, Steven, one of the things we often ask our guests is, considering the kind of dire straits the world is in terms of toxins in the environment, what do you do personally to protect yourself and your family? I
think everyone wants to feel a sense of control. We saw this, with the recent study about black plastic. I mean, we've seen a number of versions of this.
Right.
Things about like BPA-free can liners, although apparently those are being replaced with BPS. So right. I don't want to be fatalistic, and I don't want to make it sound like there is nothing anyone can do to protect themselves. But I do want to center the observation that the way out of this is through collective action, through regulation, and through big structural changes. That no amount of air and water filters, no amount of, buying the right utensils is going to protect us without these bigger structural changes.
Steven Feit, senior attorney with the Center for International Environmental Law, talking about the organization's efforts to hold energy companies accountable for their impact on our world. You can learn more about CIEL and listen to the show again at our program website, greenstreetnews.org, where you can also provide feedback to us about the show. That's going to do it for our show today. I'm Doug Wood. Patti and I will be back next week with another edition of Green Street. Thanks for listening.